Ba'al Shem Moshe Bamidbar Sinai. So this, even though this mimer is about, this essay is about the beginning of Bamidbar, it's really going to tie into Shavuos. So we have in one shot both the Parsha, next Shabbos, and Shavuos in one mimer. Surprisingly, it's not a short mimer. It's not long either. It's about 2/3 the average, 2/3 the longer size. But what's more surprising, and actually why I talked to you just now when we walked about making a list of all the Maimarim and how and what their parallel is in Likutei Torah, is that this Maimer was originally printed in Etalech Lozhna. This is a Maimer from 1879.
Well, where is it printed?
1800, sorry.
Now it's printed in?
Now it's in Likutei Torah. And the Rebbe said it, the Alter Rebbe said it before his second incarceration. So this is an example of something that he made good on his understanding when he was arrested the first time, that his purpose in life is to explain the Ba'al Shem Tov and Maggid's Shita using Torah.
Okay, and expanded.
Right?
This is an expanded.
It's very expanded. It's not short at all. I'm saying it's 2/3 the longer length. And surprisingly, it's from 1800. So it's when he was in Lozhna still. So that means that what I said is not true, at least not accurate. That he did have events when he said longer Maimarim, even when he was still in Lozhna, before he was incarcerated the second time.
This was rewritten by the Tzemach Tzedek?
It was later rewritten, yes. The version that we have is not even the Tzemach Tzedek's, it's the Ma'aril's, his brother, right? But he said this again in Kaf Tet Iyar, meaning today's Kaf Zayin. So it would be Tuesday of 1800. It was actually just like it is this year. It's exactly the same way because it was Erev Rosh Chodesh Sivan. So Tuesday was the Rosh Chodesh. This year is on Wednesday. So it's 210 years, right? No, 1800. What do we know? 221 years since this mimer was said. And I remember 221 is something important, but I can't remember exactly what. וידבר השם למשה במדבר סיני באוהל מועד, שאו את ראש בני ישראל לגולגולותם. So Hashem, they were in the desert of Sinai, and in the tent of congregation, or of how do you say moed? Either testimony they say, or they say what? Is the
Kahal?
No, moed is where Moshe Rabbeinu talks to Hashem. So there's they call it congregating, but it's like a Beit Vad. Like today you would call it a Beit Vad, like a Beis Medrash. But he's talking about the tabernacle. Right? Lift their heads to their skulls. So in these few words, which really means count them by counting the skulls. Right? How do you count the skulls? Each one brings half a shekel. And so on. But the question is, why does he call it that way? Why call it by skulls? If you already said lift their heads, that's enough. Why do you have to say the skull? Okay, so this brings up a very important topic in Chabad, which is called higher will. And basically, what? Right, and it's a very common topic. And I guess, I don't know if this is the first time he explained this. It was probably one of the first times he explained it in length, and where he got it from. To understand what it means to lift the head, and why this had to be said in the tabernacle. So first of all, we have to set up that the form of man is similar to the divine form, or at least the way the divine has revealed itself in this world, in this reality. So we can learn from the map of man how God runs the world, or how the world is set up. God said, let us make man in our image. Just as there is a head, and in it there's a skull, in the physical body, and in the head, the main thing is the brain, and the skull surrounds the brain.
Protects you.
Right? So,
It doesn't do anything. It just protects
oh, hold on. So in the physical person, it's not clear what it does. You say it's just protection. But in any case, it's a makif. It surrounds it. It protects by surrounding. There are two ways to protect something, right? What are the two ways? You can either be a bone like the skull, which surrounds it. That would be like also in the torso, would be like the ribs. And there's also what gives it strength or keeps it together by running inside it, like the bones of the limbs. Right? In the limbs, the bones run inside. So they don't protect from the outside, but they give it structure. They still give it structure. Right? So it's a little bit...
the skeleton.
Right, now that's a skeleton. But the skull is something a little bit different, because it surrounds. He says in the same way, since man is in God's image, so in the spiritual realm, כן יש ברוחניות הנפש תלת מוחין שהם חב"ד, והרצון הנמשך מהם לקיום המידות וחיותן. So he says in the same way, in the spiritual realm, there are three powers of intellect, Chabad, Chochmah, Bina, and Das, and ostensibly surrounding them, there's the Ratzon, there's the will, hanimshach mehem lekiyum hamidot v'chayutan. And here he says, the will that we're familiar with, the usual will that we're familiar with, comes out of the mind. It's a byproduct of the mind. It's a creation of the intellect. Meaning, the example would be that I understand that it's good for me to go to work, so I go to work because I have to. So where did I get my willpower to go? Because I understand that that's what I need in order to sustain my family. So that's why I go. So that's called will that comes out of the intellect. Okay?
I go to work otherwise I go crazy. I go to work.
So you understand that you'll go crazy if you don't. So that's called the lower will. Badi says, Te'it ratzon, ve'it ratzon. It says in the Zohar. Where does it say this? So here they didn't find exactly where it says this, but the closest they found was Zohar Chelek Gimel, the third volume, 129a, and it's in the Idra Rabbah. But it's a famous quote that the Alter Rebbe says: "There is will and there is will," meaning there's two types of will. It's not so clear where in the Zohar exactly he says it, but this is probably the source. And the source is the Idra Rabbah. The Idra Rabbah was the first great assembly that Rashbi had a few years before he passed away, and there he revealed the secrets of the crown, or some of the secrets of the crown, mostly of Abba and Ima, mostly of the father and mother principle. אית רצון לטאטה ואית רצון לאלה, שהוא נקרא רצון העליון, שהוא בבחינת מקיף על המוח. It says the will that we usually encounter extends down from the intellect. It's the will, that's the will that we would say is localized. Meaning, what do you mean by localized? That the brain thinks, and then the arm moves. Meaning, I understand that I need to write a letter, so I'll move my arm now. The arm won't move by itself. It won't do anything by itself.
It's all intact. You've done. You don't actually think this.
Why not?
When you sit down to write something, you pick up the pen, you start writing.
That's because you already know how to write. But if you're a child and you're going to school and you're learning how to do the motions.
Okay, but we're talking about now grown-up adult people.
Okay, so
Child of one doesn't know
yeah.
either. Okay.
Just the fact that we don't remember how we do it doesn't mean that we didn't learn at some point. And to learn, we have to exercise our will. No, so we have to exercise our will. What you're saying is now the will, it's so easy for us that we don't notice it. But we're still doing the same thing that we did when we were young. It's easier to explain. You're right, that I need to go to work, so I go to work. So I drive because I go to work. Do I remember how to drive? I don't remember how to drive. I just do it anyway. But I'm exercising my lower will. That's called the lower will. But there's a higher will, and that is the Gurgalta. That's the skull. That's represented by the skull. And it surrounds the brain. It's above the brain.
Where does Chachma Bin and Das fit in the lower will? In the mouth?
They create it. They create it. That's what people call willpower. That's what normal people say. If you understood what you needed to do, you do it. If you understood the value of what needs to be done, you would do it. You would get the willpower to do it. That's intellect that comes before will. That's called yesh tam laratzon. There is a reason for the will. And that's a big deal in Chabad, that there are two different types of will. There's will that has intellectual reason to it, and there's will, as we'll see, the higher will which surrounds the brain, so it can't be dependent on what the brain understands. It's prior to it. It's something entirely different. Okay? And it's called a makif on the brain. It's called something that's beyond the brain. ובאור עניין זה, הנה כתיב נודע בשערים בעלה, ופרש בזוהר לכל אחד לפום שיעור הדילי כמו דמשער בליבו, דהיינו על ידי שהעמיק ויתבונן מחב"ד שלו בגדולת אינסוף ברוך הוא כפי עומק מחשבתו, כאשר יוכל לשאת בליבו על ידי כן הוא מכיר את בורו הכרה בלב לדופקה בו יתברך. So he says, the lower will is described by the verse in Eishes Chayil that her husband is known in the gates. And the gates, as we know in Hebrew, also means l'sha'er. L'sha'er, ashar is l'sha'er, means to approximate, or to grasp, or to comprehend, evaluate, all these things. The Zohar learned from this that God is revealed to each person depending on how much he understands, and how much he comprehends. Lefum madem mesha'er b'divei, lefum shiur adilei. Each one based on how strong his intellect is. There are people whose intellect is very strong, so they understand God much more. They understand far more what it means to the planet having a creator, and that my life has a creator, and they feel that I was created. It didn't just come out of thin air. A lot of people just think they came out of thin air. They never think about it. They don't think, what does it mean that I have a life 70, 80, 100 years, whatever it is. And they don't think, what is the purpose? Because it doesn't trouble them, it doesn't bother them. They never get that. Why? Because even if you explained it to them, they wouldn't get it. They just don't get it. How can it be they don't get it? Because they're weak minds. It doesn't trouble them.
A weak mind or uncultivated, undeveloped mind?
I don't know why it's weak. But it depends on the mind.
The mind is moving in a different direction.
Could be. But he doesn't get it. He can't understand these things. The more abstract the thought, the less ability they have to get it. They just can't think that way. You show them, right? That's why they don't invest in Bitcoin. It's too abstract for them. They don't get it. They don't know what's going on.
That's not the reason why I don't.
I'm not talking about you. I'm talking about a lot of people that just don't get it. You show them, 1,000% profit over the 2 years? I'm in. Because profit they understand. But a change in how finances are done, they don't understand what that means. They don't care. They couldn't understand it if you tried to explain it to them. What they understand is, show me how much cheese I have in the fridge. That's what I care about. Besides, somebody who's at that level, the will that they have will always be dependent on what they can understand. So he says, God is revealed based on how much you understand.
You could improve the
You said you could cultivate a little, you could do this, you could do that. In the end, there's an end to it. Why? Because every person has a capacity of how much they can understand. Before Chassidus, the understanding was that this is the only type of will that there is. The will that's dependent on understanding. Okay? That's the only type of will there is. So if you come and tell a simple yid, do mitzvos, do some commandments. He says, what can I understand? God told me to shake a lulav. That I can understand. understand that.
What about Kabbalah Zohar?
Oh, but that's abstract. What do you mean? If you have this guy who's working as a vassal for some lord, for some nobleman, and the nobleman gives him food, then he understands. So what does the Torah say? So the Torah says, look, if you follow my commandments, I'll give you food to eat. He says, that I understand. So if you explain it to me that way, that God is the one who gives me my food, that I understand. But you hold it up to a little bit of scrutiny, and it falls apart. How is God giving you your sustenance? He's not. Your sustenance comes from the noble who gave you the money. And where did he get the money? I don't know where he got it. I don't care. And so, when a lot of people looked at the simple Yidden at that time, they said all they can understand in the end is physical reward. And if you're not going to tell them reward and punishment physically, they're not going to understand what you're talking about. They will not commit to following the commandments. They can't. That's how most of the non-Jews are. They can't understand the idea that a person should lead a moral life. They can't understand that a person should lead a holy life. Holiness is beyond them. They don't understand what that means.
Because the best is simple doesn't mean say that
That was the thinking.
a whole life.
What? What he understands, he understands. If he would understand more, he wouldn't spend more time learning and less time working. Of course he would. But the fact is, he doesn't understand. When he comes to shul, would he spend his time talking to his friends or spend his time davening? So true, he doesn't understand what the words mean exactly, but still, wouldn't he take the time to try to learn what the words mean and then have a holier experience and so on and elevate himself? So the explanation was, their will is a product of their understanding, and since their will is a product of their understanding, and their understanding is very limited, and you can't make them any more than they are, they can't understand abstract thinking.
Their will is a product of their understanding.
Mm-hmm. That's what we're saying. That's the lower will. It comes out of Bina. Nodava she'arim ba'ala. How many gates are there? 50. 50 gates of understanding. So from Bina and down, we'll explain this in a moment, a little bit more in terms of the structure, but from Bina and down, that's where the will comes from. All the will that they have that comes from what they can understand. It's called tam yesh tam laratzon. There's a reason for what they want. The opposite was that if you explain to them how badly they're going to be punished, then they'll understand why they need to keep commandments also. Because on punishment they understand.
The Ba'al Shem Tov is completely opposed to it.
Right. Right? Well, hold on. So that's what he's trying to explain. He's trying to explain the Ba'al Shem Tov's approach to simple people. Why? Why the Ba'al Shem Tov had a completely different approach. This was the approach that was accepted. The people who walked around and were called Maggidim at that time were fire and brimstone. Right. And that's how it worked. And the Ba'al Shem Tov tried to show that it's not true. That's not the only approach. Ba'al Shem Tov never explained where do you get the idea that there's another approach that's even possible. Because it makes sense. If they don't understand anything but physical reward and physical punishment, how could you get somebody like this to understand something, to have will from a higher source? So says the Alter Rebbe, I'll explain to you where the Ba'al Shem Tov got this idea from. He got it from the fact that there are two different types of will. And every person has both. He never said it this way. He never explained Yit Ratzon v'Yit Ratzon. Like I said, it's not in the Zohar either. Where the Alter Rebbe get this statement. Said when you learn the Yidra, that's what you understand. The Ba'al Shem Tov also learned the Yidra. But the Ba'al Shem Tov wasn't the sources guy. He would never quote something in that way. The most he would quote was a pasuk, maybe a saying from the Talmud. He didn't quote the Zohar.
Who?
The Ba'al Shem Tov.
Never?
Not that I know of. He wouldn't speak like that. That wasn't his style. Everything was very, very simple, down to earth. But you saw from his conduct that he's seeing the world in a different way than all the other holy people in that generation. They were also very holy, but they understood, they understood that the common person, his will, his ability to follow the commandments depends only on what he can understand. If he can't understand it, he won't follow it. There's no other source for it. So how do you get somebody to understand, to keep kosher? If you don't keep kosher, you know where you're going to burn, and you're going to do this to you, and that to you, and this and that. You're going to be sick, and who knows what. Is it true? It's probably not even true.
When I grew up, I didn't know anything. Absolutely nothing. Zero.
Yeah.
And yet I still wanted to keep kosher.
Where'd you get that idea from?
I don't know.
Well, so that's what the Ba'al Shem Tov knew.
Some didn't get it from what you're quoting as Chachma Bin and Das. Because I barely knew what my name was.
Nobody told you, if you don't do this, you'll burn, they'll fry you with the French fries. Nobody said anything like that to you. So where did you get it from? So the Ba'al Shem Tov knew this. He knew this. How did he know this? The idea is that the Ba'al Shem Tov knew this because he saw it. He didn't have to learn it. He learned it also. He also had a source. But he saw it, first of all. When he looked at a person, he saw what we're describing here in esoteric terms. He saw as concrete reality. He just looked at a person and saw it. Comes the Alter Rebbe and wants to explain what is the Ba'al Shem Tov basing himself on in terms of Torah. So he says, in the Idra, you can understand that there are two types of will. The lower will is indeed what most of the world knows about, which is called the will that comes out of understanding. And the mind guides the will. What I understand, I want. What I don't understand, I'm not interested. If you want me to get interested in something, give me some kind of explanation. You can't give me an explanation I can understand. I'm just not, it's never going to translate into will. I'm never going to do it. I'm never going to be engaged in it. Okay? The more you learn, the more you open your mind, even if you can, there are people who are geniuses, who can have tremendously abstract thought, and they can get to the heights of the heights. There were many geniuses like this in the time of the Ba'al Shem Tov. They learned and they saw the world the way that a modern person would. You don't have to explain everything to them in terms of palpable reward and punishment. They understand the value of abstract thinking. They're there. And they understand the greatness of the infinite as much as they can, as much as his heart can carry. And they culture, they cultivate in themselves a tremendous ability to daven, a tremendous ability to learn, a tremendous ability to serve Hashem, and they feel that their whole lives are dedicated to godliness. You do. There's a lot of people like that. How many people? Maybe 0.001% of the population. That's a lot of people. There's at least 100 of them, 200, maybe 1,000. Okay? Maybe there's 50,000 of them in our generation. There's so many. It's really the level of thought in our generation is higher than it ever was. There's many more. Maybe there's fewer people at the very edge, at the very top, but just below them, the 99th percentile is huge. There's a lot of people who have very abstract thought and understand the value of hopefully, okay? That's very good. But that's lower will. Even though thought cannot encompass Hashem, it can't really grasp it. Meaning he himself, his substance itself, you can't grasp. אבל הנה זה כל האדם, להתבונן במה שהוא מהווה עולמות עליונים ותוכניים עדי מספר, ומחיה את כולם, מציאה מאין ליש, מחדשם בטובו, בכל יום, בכל רגע, בכל אחד לפי מה שהוא משער בליבו, יכול לו להרחיב דעתו, להעליב ליבו ונפשו, לקשר נפשו בהשם. I'm reading all this because it's just repeating what I explained is what he's saying here. לדבקה בו כפי ערך חומק שכלו ותבונתו, כפי ריבוי ההתמדה והתשוקה שמואר בליבו, כל אחד לפי מה שהוא, להתלהב ולהתלהט לדבקה בו יתברך. So really these people, they engage their entire lives in understanding more and more abstract concepts, and they become closer to Hashem and more involved with Hashem and so on. This is all lower will. V'inei noda, what does it mean? in the pasuk that we read from Proverbs, from Eshes Chayil, Noda v'sharim ba'ala, her husband is known by the gates. The husband here is God. Okay. The Shechina is a woman. In any case, so he's known. It's known in the passive tense, l'shon nif'al. It's a passive verb. It's not yivada b'sharim ba'ala, but noda. If you say yivada, it means he will be known, and it's an active verb. Here it's a passive verb. Why? שנודע בשערים שהוא יתברך הוא המשפיל את עצמו בהשתלשלות והתפשטות גדולתו יתברך להיות נודע על ידי כן ונתפס בקרב איש בלב עמוק. Why? Because really you should know that even when it comes to your working hard, okay, don't think that you can fully grasp God. Rather, no, you grasp something. You just said you can't grasp the substance. He says even what you can grasp, don't think that it's because of your hard work. It's not your hard work that really brought you there. It's true that the hard work is needed. What?
Present from Hashem.
Okay. Really, that is passive. He becomes known. Why? Because you're like making a vessel. It's not that you've taken your mind to great heights. Rather, by working hard with your mind, it becomes a vessel for godliness to be understood in it. Meaning, God's, call it, enclothable, whatever can be vested in the human mind, it's everywhere anyway, it now finds a home in your brain. Because your brain can understand it. It's the same thing as, these strange, in the end it's very similar to like these prodigies. That suddenly at age 4 they start composing music. So what's going on? How is that possible? It's possible because their brain is hit on something. It's structured differently. And whatever music is hanging in the air just comes into it. It finds a dwelling place in it. And that goes with our general understanding in Chassidus that the brain is not what understands. The brain is only an antenna. The brain doesn't normally invent anything new. Rather, the brain is like an antenna. Your thoughts they're not happening in the brain. You only experience them. In the same way that love and fear are not in the heart. That's just a pump. But you experience it as being in your heart. In the same way, thoughts you experience in your head.
Where are they?
Everywhere. Hashem is thought. Hashem is everywhere. What happens? That you build your brain enough, you develop it enough, and slowly it becomes an antenna to understand those thoughts, to receive, to be a receptor for those thoughts.
What's this osmotic process?
Yeah, something like that. But again, it's predicated on the idea that Hashem is known. It's passive tense. It's not active. It's not like I discovered God. Again, this is one of the big differences between how Torah understands Hashem and how psychology understands Hashem. Psychology thinks that God is a human invention. Why? Because man needs God. Which is true. It's not untrue. And there are aspects of godliness that man invents. There's no question about that. People invent all kinds of stupid things about God.
For example.
Because that's what they need. It doesn't matter. Whatever they need at that moment. They think that, whatever they think at that moment. They can invent all kinds of ideas about God. Some of them are ridiculous, some of them are better, but they're a product of necessity. You think something up because, how will a scientist say it? It would be incorrect. The scientist looking at it would say, just because you feel the need that there's an afterlife doesn't make it that there's an afterlife. Okay? Just because you need to feel safe and protected and whatever doesn't mean that God is protective and a security blanket. It's not. You made it up. Some of these things that people make up are true. Some of them are not. That's one of the most important differences between psychology and Chassidus. Chassidus understands that when you have a true understanding of Hashem, it doesn't come from your necessity. It doesn't necessarily contradict your necessity. It could be that you also need it, but it didn't come because you needed it. Whereas psychology understands that 100% of what you understand about God is because you need to understand that, because you need God to be that way. The psychological thesis was stated by a guy called Feuerbach in 1890. And he didn't know Yiddishkeit at all. He was a German. He didn't know anything from Yiddishkeit. He was talking about Christianity. And he said, he went through the list of what they believe in. He said, these are all human necessities. These are all necessary by the human person, by the human psyche, to protect itself. So that's what it believes about God. In the end, all of Christianity is just a statement of what I need God to be.
So what's Judaism?
Very frustrating. Because it's got nothing to do with what I need him to be. It happens to me some of the things coincide, but they were never developed because of that. They weren't discovered because of that. They were understood by the prophets and later by the sages because of the development of the apparatus called the brain, and it picking up godliness, and it's understanding godliness. It became a vessel for understanding godliness. By the prophets, it wasn't the brain, it was something else. We'll see in this mimer, we'll talk a little bit about it. By the sages, it began to be that by developing the mind, you tap into this thing called the cloud. That's what you can imagine it. Like you're downloading from the cloud. Everybody understands that that's what prophecy is today. And everybody understands that these things were hanging around until you had a prophet who was holy enough to pick it up, to understand. That's why two prophets say the same thing, basically. Except they can't say exactly the same thing, because if they were going to say the same thing, why does God need two of them? So each one has something a little bit different, a little bit of a different take on it. When it comes to mind, it's the same thing, he says. It's nif'al, it's passive. So as you develop the mind, the more you can pick up from this cloud of understanding of God that's around you anyway. And that's what the mind... It's not necessarily so. It's what we call hashra, inspiration. It means that Hashem is everywhere. What do I mean Hashem is everywhere? Well, first of all, I mean that if you develop your brain, you begin to pick it up. You begin to pick up this idea of what Hashem is. That's why... Well, I have to talk about it. Not every type of development of the mind serves this, but it serves some aspect of it. So even a scientist who is not dealing at all with God, he's not trying to pick up anything about God, but ideas come to them. They don't know where the ideas came from. Those ideas represent what we call lower wisdom. It is wisdom. Don't think for a moment, that's what the Chazal say. Don't think for a moment that there's no wisdom in the nations. There is. Because if you develop your mind well enough, you'll pick up at least mathematics. You may pick up much more than that.
So where does Ruach HaKodesh come from?
Ruach HaKodesh is something between regular Torah wisdom and prophecy. It's somewhere in between. More specifically, it's the type of godliness picked up by Da'at. By the sphere of Da'at in the mind. And what exactly is the sphere of Da'at? It's what we call consciousness. So Ruach HaKodesh is like knowing that my initial conscious reaction to something is right. That's what Ruach HaKodesh is. That I can trust my initial reaction. That's basically the meaning. In Bina it's a little bit different, in Chochmah it's different. But Ruach HaKodesh is related to that. Okay? So what does it do? Kol chad v'chad lefum er shiur adilei, the end of the next paragraph, להמשיכו לקשר אליו יתברך לדבקה בו. So it's all called clinging. It's not called really understanding. You're not really understanding the divine. You're that's why people don't they take Torah the wrong way. They understand the Torah, you have to come out with a certain understanding. There's a right one and a wrong one. So let's learn the sugya. And if you understood the sugya, let's say the issue of, let's take an example. Any one of the Rambam's principles of faith would do. I'm trying to take one. Let's take Olam Haba. What is the world to come mean? The world of the reincarnation. What is it like? So there maybe it's easier for people to accept that there's no one solution. There's no one answer. It's not simple. But let's take something else. What does it mean that the Moshe Rabbeinu received all the Torah at Mount Sinai? Whether he received all the Torah. What does it mean? Does it mean that he received it all at Mount Sinai? Did he receive it piece by piece? And you go away from the sugya in Nadarim or wherever you're learning it, and you're like, so which one is right? So did he receive everything at Mount Sinai? Did he receive it over the 2 years through the tent of congregation for the Oel Moed? Did he receive it in the last? What's going on? And you don't get a good answer. There's no one size fits all here. There's no one definitive answer that gives you, this is how it happened. Why? Because the Torah is not a history book. Chazal are not historians. That's not what they're interested in. They won't say anything that contradicts history, but they're not trying to give you a history. What are they trying to do? They're telling you, listen, if you want to understand this topic, you have to develop your mind around this issue. And we're going to teach you all the different aspects of it that you need to think about. And you have to think about it hard and strong. I mean, you have to spend hours on it. Grueling hours of trying to understand what they're saying. And the fact that you don't come to one single conclusion in the end is not a problem. Because the point is to develop your mind along these lines. The point is to create contours in the brain, as it were. And that was the word I was looking for last week. It's like contours of crevices in the brain. That's how you create the antenna. And then you'll see. Then something will come down to you. If you create the basic contours that the mind is supposed to think along, then you'll receive the message, let's call it. And the message is not a simple one. Why is it not a simple one? Because the sugya of how Hashem revealed the Torah to Moshe Rabbeinu is not a historical question. It's not a question about how the events actually happened. Because that's not what we're trying to teach. We're trying to teach how is it, in what way does Torah come down from heaven? In what way are you inspired to understand this? And it's complex. There's not one simple answer to it. It happens in many ways. So one sage thinks this and the other sage thinks that. And they build everything in such a way that if you are now going to spend your time, invest your time learning this, your brain will become an antenna for this topic. Yeah? That's what he's saying. So in the end, the brain clings to God. By learning, you bring the brain to cling. Iskashrus. To connect.
That brain clings to God, or you bring God into your brain?
You have to set up the connection first. It's like a modem. You have to first set up the connection. Once you have the connection, stuff can come down. But if you don't set up the connection, how do you set up the connection? By training your brain, by learning the topics in the Talmud, by learning the commentaries on it. The moment you learn, even if you don't have a clear picture in the end, it's fine. Because that's not the point. The point is not a clear picture. This is not mechanistic. Right? We're dealing with something that's alive. So it's how connected you are to the sugya. Once you're connected to the sugya, new things come down. And that's the famous thing, the famous story of the Alter Rebbe also had this. Many people had this experience, that they sat very hard on a question they didn't understand in the Talmud. And after a few days of a lot of toil, they got to a new answer. So they were amazed. Like, I worked so hard to get the answer. And then they go to some base measures somewhere else, and they hear a young man saying the same answer, like just like that. So what did they learn from this? They learned from this that the moment that somebody's downloaded it's easily accessible. It's easily accessible. Even somebody who's just starting the sugya might be able to hook into it. Understand? So it's an understanding that it's not the brain that's creating the answer. The brain is just the receiver. It's a receptor, and it's receiving a message from above. That's a different. That's about Torah. I said scientists are the same way, because if you're dealing with something in nature and you're trying to understand it, and you spend 2, 3, 4, 5, 10 years studying it, and collecting data and trying to fit the function to it and this and that, and you create a theory. You worked really hard. So the person thinks, it's my toil that created this. He says, no, if you understood anything about nature, it's because you created the vessel, and then the understanding came down. Where did this understanding come down from? It didn't come from God per se. It comes from the lower revelation of God, or the lower concealment of God, called nature. Nature, you tapped into nature. That's basically what you did. And it takes a long time. In the same way that to become a Talmid Chacham takes a long time. Why is it called the Talmid Chacham? Because he's a Talmid of the Chachma. He's a student of wisdom. He's not the wise. He's not wise yet. He's a Talmid Chacham. Okay? It's true, it should have been called Talmid Chochmah. That would be weird to say. Talmid Chochmah. I know. He's in Hebrew, Talmid Chacham. What you mean is, he's a good student. Who is he studying from? The wisdom. The wisdom. Where's the wisdom? It's hanging all over you. Because Hashem is everywhere. And in this regular order of things, which is the only way the things were, which was the only way things were before the Ba'al Shem Tov. So the only ability to act, to have will, was based on this type of learning. The learning, understanding, would create a will in the soul, which would translate as avanira, that you love something, you're afraid of something. Love something would mean you would look for the best etrog you could, because you love doing mitzvos and you want them to be the best. Yira would mean they would be very extra careful with the meat that you eat, because you have fear of God. But this all came from an understanding. Because you can only love that which you want. That's not called falling in love. That's called loving because you want something. That's not falling, that's thinking and willing to love. You're convinced that this is a good thing, then you want it. And because you want it, you love it. And that's your connection, that's your affinity to it. That's also called lower love. And nobody, when he has lower love, falls head over heels. There are people who, they go to become a professor of English in the university because that's the only thing they can do. So they understand, I need to make a living. He understands this. He says, what am I good at? I'm good at with words. I understand them well. I have a knack for it. I can go into a university and be a professor. And here I am. I'm making a living. What do I have to do to make that living? I have to teach English. Okay. He doesn't love English. He's good at it. He doesn't love it. He gets better over the years. Maybe he starts putting his heart into it, because he understands that it's better to put your heart into something because it feels better. You do it better. You get more good comments, good criticism about what you did, and so on. You're a better teacher. But that's all love that came out of his will, out of his need to fulfill his needs. That's all it is. So that's lower will. It's not it's wrong. It's fine. It's a very good life. Alavai, every person should be able to lead their life in such a organized manner that they know what they need, They go and do it, and they do it well, and they can even put their heart into it. It can be just not just interest, but it can become affinity. They mamish care for it. Okay, that's not love yet. Meaning it's love, but it's the lower form of love. It's the lower form of will. What he hates is something that is against his will. והוא לפי ערך ההשגה וההשכלה בגדולתו התברכתם ומלא כל עמים וסובב כל עמים כי ממנו נלקח רצון זה ולכן נקרא רצון התחתון שהוא למטה מן הדעת. But this is all predicated on what you understood, on what you grasped.
What's it predicated?
It depends. It's defined by. And to predicate is to define. So it's all defined by what you understood. If you didn't understand, you wouldn't come to love this, you wouldn't come to hate this. Everything is dependent on what you understand. That's called lower will. Tomorrow we'll see what higher will is. And this the Chiddush of the Ba'al Shem Tov was the way he treated simple Yidden, the way he treated the simple person was that even the simple person is not limited to lower will. So it's not that all he can do in terms of keeping mitzvot and refraining from what's forbidden depends on the little that he can understand. And so therefore you don't have to frighten him, you don't have to promise him all kinds of nonsense, whether it's true or not, doesn't matter. You can trust him to do, or you can appeal to his higher will. And that's what we'll talk about tomorrow. Again, the Ba'al Shem Tov, I don't think ever called it higher will. I'll check today, but I don't remember him ever calling it that. But you see from the way he conducted himself that he was aiming at this, and that's what the Alter Rebbe now is trying to explain. Say no.